Donald Trump seeks presidential immunity in his federal election subversion case. We want to have a conversation with someone who was actually hired by his campaign after the 2020 election. Voting data analyst Ken Block joins us now. He owns Simpatico Software Systems, and he wrote the new book, Disproven. He also recently wrote an opinion piece for USA Today titled, Trump Paid Me to Find Voter Fraud. He then lied after I found the 2020 election wasn't stolen. Ken, thank you so much for being with us. First, I want to start with why you think the Trump campaign hired you and whether you ever got the sense that they wanted you to bring them findings that went beyond the truth.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on. I don't believe that, actually, I know for a fact that there were no expectations placed upon me in terms of you must deliver us fraud no matter what. As we negotiated my contract to do this work, I was very clear with them that the data would take me wherever it led and that would have to be acceptable to the campaign. And the campaign was very gracious about that and said, no, we totally understand that. This is surprising to a lot of people, but the Trump campaign attorneys that I reported to wanted an honest assessment of voter fraud so that they didn't file erroneous lawsuits. There were a couple of different camps of lawyers involved in the litigating the election. I worked for the more careful group.
I see. You do write that your team communicated directly with the White House Chief of Staff at the time, Mark Meadows, that you found no evidence of widespread voter fraud. I'm curious if you got a sense of his reaction and whether you know how and when that message was communicated to President Trump.
So I do have answers to those questions. The lawyer that I reported to in the January 6th committee hearings was broadcast on TV during those hearings, describing his interactions with Mark Meadows when he brought Mr. Meadows the results, the totality of our results, which said no substantive voter fraud was found sufficient to overturn an election in any of the swing states. Mark Meadows' response in the sworn deposition by the attorney that I reported to was that Meadows said, well, that means there's no there, referring to the claims of voter fraud. And then we saw some reporting by the Washington Post within the last 2 months that Mr. Meadows communicated to Jack Smith's investigators that he had taken the news of no valid claims of voter fraud into the Oval Office.
Sure. So Ken, what was your reaction then, knowing that you found no voter fraud, to then seeing President Trump and his allies echoing what ultimately was a lie?
Yeah, it's hard to watch and it's hard to listen to. I try and put the politics outside of it. What worries me greatly is I have a lot of friends and acquaintances who only hear about the claims of fraud, and they believe firmly that voter fraud must be everywhere because that's the only news they received. It's the only messaging that they're hearing from their politicians. And what's frustrating for me is the fact that I was the guy. I looked for it. It wasn't there. And that information has not been covered by one conservative media outlet anywhere in the country. And it's really problematic for everybody that we're not getting balanced information about what actually happened in the 2020 election. And that's how I find myself in front of you today.
Yeah, so Ken, I don't want to get into the weeds with the methodology, but just on the surface, you write that voter fraud is, quote, detectable, quantifiable, and verifiable. You added that none of the allegations you saw about 2020 provides those three things. Help us understand what that means. Is it possible that your analysis somehow missed something?
Well, of course it's possible that an analysis missed something. You have to understand that in the starting the day after the election, there's roughly a 30-day period in which you can contest an election result before most states certify the results. And once the results are certified, there really isn't much you can do from a legal perspective. So inside that 30 days, we covered a lot of ground in a hurry. We did as much as was humanly possible with the size of the staff and the budget that we had. I would never claim that it was completely exhaustive. On the other hand, what I would tell you, though, is if there was fraud and if it was provable and verifiable and everything else, somebody would have brought it forward by now. So the fact that that hasn't happened makes me very confident that we didn't miss anything in the work that was done in November of 2020.
But I'm sure you've heard from friends that talked about those 60 plus cases that Trump and his team brought, arguing that there was election fraud, arguing that those dismissals were politically motivated, that perhaps the Supreme Court was too scared to take on the issue of widespread election fraud. What do you say to those folks close to you who still believe that Trump won in 2020?
Some of my work product for the campaign stopped some lawsuits that were going to be based on some astonishingly bad data analytics. And a lot of the other cases that were thrown out because claims of harm couldn't be brought, couldn't be quantified, a whole bunch of complex legal requirements to make a successful argument that an election should be overturned. Not one of the cases that I'm familiar with came anywhere close to meeting the legal burden of proof necessary for a valid claim that could come out there and cause the upheaval that was being looked for in these court cases. And you have to bear in mind that my job, first and foremost, was to deliver the findings to help inform some of these lawsuits, and I was utterly unable to come anywhere close to delivering enough fraud to matter.
Ken Block, we very much appreciate your time, and we look forward to the book. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.